Welcome, everybody. I'm sorry it got a little bit crazy here tonight. There's two bookings here at Concordia this evening, so you picked the better one. But the parking lot got a little crowded, so I apologize. It's always my pleasure to welcome you, and I always like to begin by thanking the Friends because their support is so important and makes these programs possible. So thank you to the Friends of Concordia, and if you're not a friend, please become a friend. I'm delighted to welcome Stephen Case, co-author of Treacherous Beauty, Peggy Shippen, the woman behind Benedict Arnold's plot to betray America. How fitting to be celebrating betrayal, to study betrayal on this Ides of March Eve. Stephen Case is Managing Director and General Counsel of Emerald Development Managers. He is a trustee of the American Revolution Center and has been an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Law Center. For 29 years, he was a partner with the law firm of Davis, Polk & Wardwell. He has served long tenures on the boards of Columbia University, New York Presbyterian Hospital, and the Glimmerglass Opera. Judged in her own time with the common view that women lacked the sophistication for politics and warfare, Peggy Shippen was a mere footnote in the history books until Stephen's personal curiosity demanded a closer look. Examining all available histories and letters, he became an expert on the Peggy Shippen story, and eventually a collaborator, as most clever plots require, with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Mark Jacob to complete the first biography of one of the Revolutionary War's most remarkable and until now little-known women. In the poem, The Fiction of History, John Wood writes, "Even in the comfortable concentration of our lives, we demand history, need those ever-shifting chronicles of good and bad, the explanations of our loss and gain, the backstabber, the turncoat, love's traitor, all with the poisoned rose upon their lips, or luck, an accident, labeled glittering insight, raw bravery, immeasurable generosity, all haloing our heads in humble orbits." Stephen Case and Mark Jacob present a very different picture from that historical footnote. In Wood's words, backstabber, turncoat, traitor, and poisoned rose all suggest the Peggy Shippen they uncover. The Chicago Tribune praised it as scrupulously researched and fascinating. According to the Philadelphia Inquirer, Treacherous Beauty is history with all the sex, suspense, knavery, and bravery of a spy thriller. I think it would make a great movie. Please join me in welcoming Stephen Case.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out on a nice Thursday night to listen to this. Some people call Peggy Shippen the most dangerous teenage woman in American history. That might be debatable, but she's a good candidate. There is writings of the time in which she was declared to be the most beautiful woman in North America. She wouldn't make it this year because all the most beautiful women in North America are in the room tonight. Later in her life, when she was living in England, one of her friends from Philadelphia wrote home to Mother and said she saw Peggy riding horseback and never looked lustier. So we have, I think, an interesting lady here. Ladies in the audience, I ask you to consider you're 15 years old. You're living in one of the finest houses in town. Your grandfather was a co-founder of Princeton University. Your father was the mayor. Your great-grandfather was the Princeton founder. Your grandfather was the mayor of Philadelphia. Your father is the most prominent lawyer in Philadelphia, or one of the most ones. You have two sisters and a brother. You have a house with 3 slaves in it. And everything is going well, and then all of a sudden, a war parachutes into your life, which when I first encountered her story, it reminded me of the fictional Scarlett O'Hara. Everybody in the room, I'm sure, has seen Gone with the Wind, and we all know how Scarlett's life on the plantation got turned topsy-turvy when the war parachuted in it. Ditto for Larissa Antipov in Dr. Zhivago, and how the Russian Revolution changed her life. The difference between Peggy and Scarlett and Lara is that Peggy's is a true story. Let me come back to that in a minute, but before we do that, I have to ask your indulgence to digress for a minute and a half into an issue of military logistics, because later in the story it's important. Now, all of you nice folks living in Westchester County, is there anybody in the room who has never visited the military academy at West Point? Okay. If you haven't visited, no hands went up, but there might be a shy person. If you go up there, as you know, the river makes two sharp turns, and the U.S. Military Academy is way up high. What that amounts to in the Revolutionary War period is if you're in a British naval vessel and you want to go north on the Hudson River, you have to slow down, even on a windy day, to make the turns at West Point. And when you slow down, George Washington's cannons up on the bluff are going to blow you to smithereens. Now, why is this important to Peggy Shippen? Be patient. For most of the American Revolution, starting in January of 1777, with exceptions, but for most of the time, it was a stalemate war, with George Washington's army stretching from Newburgh across those mountains down into the Ramapos and then down into the Watchung south to about Bound Brook, New Jersey. And they spent the winters up there, and then they would occasionally get detached to go fight a battle somewhere. And the British spent the war comfortably ensconced, living in lower Manhattan with their big navy in New York Harbor. Now, all of those guys with their tattered uniforms up in the mountains from Newburgh south needed food, clothes, weapons, and ammunition. Where did they get it? Well, it was all run by European powers who were enemies at the time of the British Royal Crown, principally the French and the Dutch. If you are an opera fan, you know the stories of Marriage of Figaro and The Barber of Seville. They are both based on a play or plays written by a French author named Beaumarchais. Well, Mr. Beaumarchais was also a secret operative for the King of France, and he was in charge of gun running to George Washington until the French entered the war in 1778. I'm getting to a point. Don't give up on me yet. And those supplies from the French and the Dutch came into Portsmouth, New Hampshire, very far away from the threats of the British Navy. And then they were shipped to the Hudson River, and then you had to get them across the Hudson River to get to the army from Newburgh south. If the big British Navy had been able to get north of West Point, it could have shut off those supplies. And according to the memoirs of the British General Clinton and post-war statements of Benedict Arnold, if the British could have captured West Point, got the chain out of the river, and sent their navy to the north, it would have forced George Washington to come out and fight, and he either would have had to win the battle and win the war, or like he was just about every time he took on the British head on, he would have gotten clobbered. So that the point here is, and it gets important later in the story, the real estate that's now the U.S. Military Academy was the single most strategic piece of real estate in the whole American Revolution. Okay, said that. Now let's get back to Peggy. The revolution begins in April of 1775 in Boston. Peggy was born in 1760, so she's 14 going on 15. She has already gotten to know George Washington because when he came to Philadelphia the preceding fall to be a delegate to the First Continental Congress. Just about the first place he went for dinner was to Peggy's house. They were the people you went to. They were the socially prominent people that everybody had to deal with. So she knows George Washington. The war starts. Now, I ask you, if you were today in a nice community like Bronxville, the Bronxville area, enjoying prosperity and social prominence, only it was Aleppo or Damascus, Syria, and everything was going great in your life, what are you going to do when the disruptions in Syria occur? Are you going to take one side or the other side, or are you going to try to duck it and hope you can get through it and keep what you have? Very interesting choice. And the professional historians who've studied the American Revolution will tell you that the best data is about 1/3 of the population, all for George Washington. 1/3 of the population was all for King George. And the other third just wished the whole damn thing would go away. Okay? Peggy Shippen's father, prominent lawyer, in my opinion, the record isn't overwhelming about this, but when I give this talk, which I love to do, I'm willing to go a little beyond the book and tell you some interpretations of the fact that aren't that well established by the record. I think he was just trying to duck the whole thing. And now the next question is, if your father is ambiguous about who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, and you're 15, what conclusion are you going to reach when you're the 15-year-old daughter, huh? And I think that is sort of part of the root of what happened to Peggy Shippen's life in the ensuing years. So what did her father do? He bought a 200-acre farm about 50 miles from Philadelphia, 2 miles east of my old hometown, Flemington, New Jersey, which I didn't know when I started doing research. And he lived in a beautiful home. He bought a beautiful home built in 1760 by a colonial governor of New Jersey. And he announced to his friends in Philadelphia that he was going to sit out the war and run a general store. That was nonsense. I know the town, I know the house, I know the man who owns the house. I've been going to that house since I was 2 years old. And there's nobody anywhere near it, and nobody in a horse and buggy age is going to go there to buy anything at a general store if in fact he ran a general store. Well, this approach flopped badly for 2 reasons. He buys it in June of 1776 for 3,000 pounds. He later flipped it 3 years later for 9,000 pounds. He did, okay, maybe it was wartime inflation, but he didn't lose any money on it. It's all in the deeds in the courthouse there. In the summer of 1776, George Washington occupied Manhattan, and the British invaded and beat the tar out of him. And by October and November of 1776, what's left of Washington's army is retreating pell-mell across New Jersey. So then if you're Mr. Judge Shippen and you're living there, the possibility that the British Army is going to be in your backyard in a week or two isn't appealing, and maybe you want to go back to Philadelphia, which he did. And the other factor was that his family didn't like living in the boonies with all the mostly German origin country people. Shortly before she died, Peggy wrote to her father about life in that community, saying she couldn't stand it because it was full of card-playing, tattling old maids. So anyway, the family packs up from the safety of the country and goes back to Philadelphia, getting there, I would guess, early 1777. And of course, that's when George Washington had gotten to the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River, pulled the famous raid on Christmas night, and drove the Hessian soldiers away from the Delaware River. And then he moved his army, his headquarters at Morristown, and that's when the encampments in the mountains settled in. And there wasn't much fighting again until the following summer and the following fall. In the fall of 1777, the British put their troops in the boats in New York Harbor, sailed to the bottom of Chesapeake Bay, sailed north to Elkton, Maryland, a northern point in Chesapeake Bay, debarked on a march to conquer Philadelphia, which was the Patriot capital. And George Washington marched his troops down there from the mountains, met them south of Philadelphia at Brandywine, and got licked. So, in the early fall of 1777, George Washington retreated out of Philadelphia and set up the famous encampment of Valley Forge, and the British Army marched triumphantly up Chestnut Street and took over Philadelphia. Marching with the British Army was a handsome, popular officer named John Andre, 9 years older than Peggy. He had met her once before, complicated details that aren't important, and this is now October of 1777, and the British settle into Philadelphia for the winter, and because of muddy roads and what have you, there were little skirmishes and little raids, but not much fighting. Now, Andre was an Englishman, has the French-sounding name because his parents were run out of France as Protestants, Huguenots, settled in England, became very prosperous. The father operated a business which the contemporary record calls a counting house in London. We tried to figure out what you would call a counting house today. We couldn't do it. And the family owned a rich sugar plantation on the island of Grenada. Andre, 5 or 6 years before this, had a failed romance, left England, studied at the University of Göttingen in Germany, did some other work at a school. He was a skilled artist, could draw a picture of anything. He put on plays, and he was devilishly handsome. And he and the other bright, young, handsome officers amused themselves in the winter in Philadelphia by keeping company with beautiful local young women. What else is new, right? And we don't know exactly how close the relationship between Peggy Shippen and John Andre was, because after the famous treason, which we'll get to in a minute, happened, every document in the Shippen family that related to Peggy Shippen before the treason was exposed somehow disappeared. From my days as a practicing lawyer and knowing that her father was a clever lawyer, I suspect we had destruction of documents and obstruction of justice, but the record doesn't establish that. So we really don't know, except for a couple of clues that we get to in a minute. In April of 1778, word reaches Philadelphia that because the Americans have done well in battle, the French have entered the war. They declared war on England. This was so threatening to England that there is some documentation saying the English were going to just pull their army out of North America altogether to defend rich trading islands in the Caribbean, but they didn't. But they didn't like having their fleet in Delaware Bay. They thought New York Harbor was safer, and maybe the senior people preferred living in Manhattan to Philadelphia, ahead of W.C. Fields. And, you tell some people Philadelphia's a wonderful city, you tell people you're going to Philadelphia and they say, gee, what's eighth prize? And so the British government fires the commander, General Howe, and all of a sudden the British are pulling out of Philadelphia and going to Manhattan. But the young officers decided they had to have a fancy party, whether it was, thank God we're getting rid of General Howe, or General Howe, we're sorry to see you go and we want to have a celebration, or whether they just wanted to have another party for the local women. We don't really know, but they spent huge amounts of money on this fancy party, which was so decadent that it got written up at the time in European magazines as decadent beyond anything you could believe, and it was. And all the young women were given silk taffeta, Turkish maiden dresses, and the British officers were knights, and there was jousting and fireworks at a fancy house along the Delaware River. Quite a show. Make the great scene in the movie that will probably never get made. One of the artifacts of that party is a drawing of Peggy Shippen in her fancy party outfit, which is in the Yale Art Collection. And the artist who drew the picture was our friend John Andre. Now, that's one of the bases to infer that this was more than just a shake your hand relationship at balls and things in Philadelphia, but we don't know for sure. Peggy was invited to go to the party along with her two sisters. The record is inconclusive. One set of documents in the record says the father refused to let them go because that was inconsistent with his neutrality, and some Quakers in town told him they didn't like his daughters consorting with the British. But one of the granddaughters of one of the sisters told historians later in the 19th century that her mother went and both the sisters went and they had the time of their life. So we don't know whether she went to the party. But we do know that in June of 1778, when the British leave Philadelphia, Peggy, 18 years old, was practically a spinster by local standards. Okay? You didn't marry when you were 29 in those days, and her friends were getting married. One of her sisters was getting married. Okay, and then we come now to the third player in our little romantic triangle here, and that's the famous Benedict Arnold. What I think about Benedict Arnold is that he was clearly the best field commander that George Washington had in the whole Revolution. And you can tick off the things he did. Anybody here ever go to Powder Keg Day in New Haven? That was right, they celebrate it still every year, right after the beginning of the Revolution, when he was a militia officer in Philadelphia and New Haven. He wanted to get his men and go join up in Boston and fight the bad guys. And the local officials wouldn't let him get into the place where all the gunpowder was held. And he had enough gunpowder and sent his men down there, pointed guns at the officials, and they opened up the powder keg, or whatever it's called, powder house. And off he went to Boston. The first thing he did was to lead an expedition up to Lake Champlain to rout the British out of Fort Ticonderoga, which was full of British cannons, which over the winter they took on sleds down to Boston, and they put them up on Dorchester Heights, and that's what drove the British out of Boston on March 17th, 1776, celebrated in Boston not only as St. Patrick's Day, but also as Evacuation Day, even to this moment. Then he got permission from the newly appointed George Washington to lead a contingent of men in unbelievable wilderness across what is now northern Maine to join another patriot force and attack Quebec and make Canada part of what the winners, if the Patriots won, Canada would be part of the United States. They almost won. They lost by a whisker on December 31st, 1776, and Arnold sustains the first of two bad wounds in the left leg. He then retreats down to the south end of Lake Champlain, and they were afraid the British were going to try to get to West Point from the north, so he found a bunch of guys who knew how to build rowboats. And if you now go to that town, it's Whitehall, New York. There are big signs declaring that Whitehall, New York is the birthplace of the United States Navy, because that's where Arnold built these ships. One of them was later dug up from the bottom of Lake Champlain and used to be, if it's not now, on display at the American History Museum in the Smithsonian in Washington. So sure enough, the British were coming down Lake Champlain. Arnold took all his boats and hid behind a place called Valcour Island. And just at the time when the British thought they had clear sailing, he led his boatsmen out of Valcour Island, and the British got all upset, and they sunk all of Arnold's ships, and he got away within an inch of his life. But the British chickened out and turned around and went back to Montreal. And Winston Churchill said he thinks it was one of the most decisive moves by any military leader in the whole American Revolution. But that wasn't the end. A year later, they again tried to come down and get to West Point from the north by land with General Burgoyne. Long story short, Burgoyne's people were all captured at Saratoga, and everybody credits Benedict Arnold, who was insubordinate to his commander, for going out into the field and making the moves that defeated Burgoyne. He was the George Patton or U.S. Grant of his time. He was passed over for promotions. They weren't paying his expense account. He was difficult, got in duels with other officers, had a lot of reasons to feel unrecognized and unappreciated, and he was also badly crippled. So, we now have Peggy Shippen, the 18-year-old almost spinster. We have a gentleman that she admired, John Andre, who has left Philadelphia and gone back to Manhattan with the British. And we have Benedict Arnold, who reports to duty in Philadelphia that George Washington has just marched into. Washington wants him to resume field command, and he doesn't feel up to it because of the effects of his 2 leg wounds. So Washington appoints him military commander of Pennsylvania. The civilian head of government in Pennsylvania was my candidate for the villain in the piece, a man exactly Benedict Arnold's age, separated by a few weeks, named Joseph Reed. Reed had at one time been George Washington's closest staff assistant, traveling with him through the Boston and New York campaigns. It's a whole nother story about why they had a falling out, but I think Washington was the good guy and Reed was the bad guy. Reed is the governor of Pennsylvania. Arnold is the military commander. George Washington did not do a good job of getting it worked out who was in charge of what. So, I bet you a lot of people in this room who have been in organizations where 2 strong, ambitious people of the same age have jockeyed with each other for power. Well, that's what happened in Philadelphia. And Joe Reed starts a campaign against Benedict Arnold that was more vitriolic than the attacks on Nixon and Watergate. It starts with newspaper articles saying that he was stealing from the Army and all sorts of other charges. This leads literally to a congressional committee investigation. Congressman Paca from Maryland, nothing ever changes around here. And the congressional committee is indecisive. It can't make up its mind, so they send a letter to George Washington saying he needs to consider whether General Arnold should be court-martialed. He has no choice. A court-martial is convened. It's being conducted in Morristown, New Jersey, in the mountains there where the headquarters were. During the time when this fight between the 2 age peers is developing, something else developed. Arnold was a widower, 38 years old, with 3 boys. Peggy Shippen took a shine to him, or he took a shine to Peggy Shippen. We don't quite know where it started, but they got married in April of 1779, okay? Peggy's father, their letters, he wasn't so sure about this, but he acquiesced. There's inconclusive records if you've ever been a tourist in Philadelphia. There's a beautiful old colonial home in West Fairmount Park, right on the Schuylkill River, called Mount Pleasant. Arnold was in the process of buying it. We really couldn't figure out whether he ever did, but there's something in the record, and the folklore is clear that he was going to move in there with her. But Arnold, who had been unhappy before the court-martial, he was ultimately convicted of 1 count of misusing Army wagons in the court-martial. George Washington wrote a 1-sentence letter with a minor wrist slap and hoped it would all go away, but it didn't go away. because just about the time of the wedding in April of '79, guess who has become the closest confidant of the British commander in New York and has been anointed, among other things, head of spying for the British? Our handsome friend, the artist, John Andre. There then starts, in code with invisible ink and all sorts of other crazy methods of communication, Peggy and Benedict Arnold start communicating with John Andre about how much will the British pay Arnold if he defects. And there was, to make it clear right now in this report, in the 1920s, the British General Clinton's descendants sold his papers to the University of Michigan. So all of these coded letters, including some clearly written by Peggy, became public for the first time. So since those documents came out, there has never been any question that Peggy knew what was going on and was completely involved, all right? So this negotiation goes on, you know, nobody had email. It took a long time to do this. And it's getting serious, and Arnold is forever leaking important information in these letters, and General Clinton isn't sure that it isn't a fake, and, you know, they had their uncertainties. But we get to the summer of 1780, and Washington wants to put Arnold back into field command, and Arnold instead practically begs for appointment as the commander of, you guessed it, West Point. Okay? So Arnold gets sent to West Point in August of 1780. Peggy and the baby arrive 3 weeks later. They don't live on the west side of the river in the fort. They live in a house that's burned down in the 1920s in Garrison across the river, and there's still a trail there, which the Garrison people call the Arnold Trail. Now, why would you not live on the army post? Maybe you had in mind that there would be somebody else attacking the army post, and you wanted your wife and baby across the river in a safe place, huh? So then in late September, the French General Rochambeau is in the United States. He wants to talk to George Washington. They meet in Hartford. And Washington announces that on his way back from Hartford, he is going to visit West Point to inspect the works. Oh boy, what a chance. We will not only have the British invade West Point, where Arnold has rigged it so the defenses don't work. We will do it when George Washington is there. We will capture West Point. We will hang George Washington, and the American Revolution will be over, and John Andre in England will be made the most senior duke in the whole dukedom of King George III. So the plot thickens. And the first thing that happens is Andre and Arnold agree to meet at midnight in Haverstraw Bay, not far from here. And up the river comes Andre in a British warship. He is rowed to shore. He meets Arnold, and they talk all night about perfecting plans. An hour or so before daybreak, when he's supposed to be rowed back to the warship, an American militiaman, the equivalent of the National Guard, who's acting under his own supervision, sees the British warship out in there near where the Tappan Zee Bridge is today and starts shooting small cannons at it. Well, the oarsmen refuse to row Andre back. Oh, what do you do? So Arnold and the host in the house they were staying in said, well, look, take off your uniform and we'll give you some civilian clothes and we'll get you back to Manhattan by horseback. This is against Andre's orders because if you're an enemy officer and you're caught behind your enemy's lines out of uniform, you're automatically a spy. That's why Nathan Hale got hanged by the British. So Andre heads back with a companion on horseback until they get to Tarrytown, where the companion, about 3 miles north of Tarrytown, the companion says, the British line is in Tarrytown, you're fine, I'm going home. So Andre gets to the bridge in Tarrytown, where there's a monument to this event to this day, and 3 guys on the bridge stop him, one of whom is wearing a red coat. Andre thinks the guy with the red coat is a British. Turns out he's an American who'd been a British POW and escaped taking a British red coat with him. So he talks to this guy, saying, "Oh, I'm glad to be with you," in the so-called, with the slang of the time, here with the lower party. And the guy says, "Lower party, my foot, who are you?" Andre claimed he was John Anderson. And then the record is a little unclear. Were these 3 guys robbers who really wanted money, or were they really George Washington militia guards? The record is unclear. The record seems to indicate there was a little discussion about money, and Andre made an offer, but it wasn't enough. Whatever happened, Andre gets unhorsed and they pull off his boots. In his boots, they find all the maps of West Point, Boku handwriting, and the handwriting of Benedict Arnold. And they scratch their heads and they say, well, maybe they said he doesn't have enough money, or maybe they said this looks fishy, let's turn him into a real army officer. So they take him to North Salem, even closer to here, I guess, where the local command post is with a colonel named Jameson. Jameson does not know what to make of this. Here are things that Benedict Arnold shouldn't have given to anybody, but Arnold is his boss. But then he knows also that George Washington is coming across, and he wants to protect himself, so he sends the prisoner, who he thought was a civilian named John Anderson, and a note to Arnold's house in Garrison, and he sends a note to George Washington to be intercepted on the road. Well, after the prisoner and the 2 messages left, a young officer comes in named Benjamin Talmadge, sort of the hero of the piece. Talmadge was a Yale classmate and a close friend of Nathan Hale, and he has it in for the British, because they got his buddy from Yale. And he hears about this, and he has heard rumors. So he tells his boss, Colonel Jameson, Arnold is a traitor, send a force up there and arrest him immediately. And Jameson says, shut up, you little, I'm inventing dialogue here to make the point. Jameson says, shut up, you little twerp, you tell me to arrest my boss, if you don't keep quiet, I'll arrest you. So then Talmadge says, well, for heaven's sake, let your note go if you won't listen to me, but at least bring the prisoner back, because if this really is a scheme, you don't want the prisoner to go get back and let Arnold protect him. So they send fast horses, and they bring Andre back to North Salem, and there he's put in Talmadge's custody, and we'll get to his outcome in a minute. So we have this drama unfolding. A messenger looking for George Washington on the road from Hartford, Route 6 today, I-84 wasn't there, and another note headed for Arnold's house at Garrison. Well, George Washington is traveling with Alexander Hamilton and the Marquis de Lafayette, and they all want to get to the house. And Washington sees something in Beacon or Fishkill or one of those places, and he said, wait a minute, I want to stop here and inspect this. And according to a letter written by, I guess this was written up by Washington Irving in the 1820s, according to Lafayette, they all said, oh, General, oh, Your Excellency, we can't stop or we'll be late for brunch at General Arnold's house. And Washington is reputed to have said, oh, I know, and I'm not inventing this, I know all of you young men are in love with General Arnold's wife from your days in Philadelphia, and if you can't wait, go ahead. But of course, they stayed with the boss. So Arnold is sitting there at his dining room table waiting for George Washington and the entourage to arrive. There's a knock on the door. It's the messenger with the note. I've got a prisoner named John Anderson and some papers of yours. What's going on? Benedict Arnold opens up this letter. According to a witness, he, quote, appeared to be very agitated, unquote. He runs upstairs for no more than a minute and a half, where Peggy is on the second floor nursing the baby, and we presume he said something like nuts or worse. the jig is up. I'm out of here. See you around. He goes down the riverbank to where he has a boat crew and says, row me down the river. And he rows down to the same warship that brought Andre up, which is still parked there in Haverstraw Bay, waves a white handkerchief, says, I am defecting, let me come aboard. And oh, by the way, arrest my boat crew as prisoners of war. Nice guy. Okay? Arnold is then sailed back to Manhattan, made a general in the British Army. So that ends this chapter for him. What about Peggy? Well, here she is. Think about this, ladies. She's 20 years old. She has the baby. Her husband has just walked out, and she has to entertain George Washington, the Marquis de Lafayette, and Alexander Hamilton as her house guests. Well, in the meantime, the note hasn't caught up with George Washington, so they get to the house about lunchtime. Everybody says, where's General Arnold? Oh, he must have gone over to the fort. He'll meet you there. So Washington leaves Hamilton behind and goes over to the fort. There's no 19-gun salute for the commanding officer. No Benedict Arnold. He comes back about 3:30 or 4. The record is pretty clear about these facts. He comes back about 3:30 or 4 in the afternoon. Alexander Hamilton is sleeping in a chair in the dining room. And Washington wakes him, what's going on? No General Arnold. And Hamilton, sort of gathering his consciousness, says, I don't know, but this note came for you while you were gone. Washington opens it up, and he immediately recognizes, puts together 2 and 2, and utters if you follow this, the famous remark, Arnold has betrayed us. Whom can we trust now? All through this, no Peggy, okay? Now, Arnold had a staff aide named Richard Varick. Richard Varick later becomes the mayor of New York, and the developers moving north in Manhattan want to curry favor with the mayor. They name a street after him. But at this point in time, he's just a young colonel working for Benedict Arnold. Peggy's he's sick, sick in his bed. And Peggy emerges, putting on a mad scene straight out of a Donizetti opera. Donizetti and Lucia di Lammermoor could have copied this. She goes into Varick's room, he's on his sickbed. Oh, someone is coming to the house to put hot irons in my head. Colonel Varick, are you going to murder my children? And Varick at this point doesn't really know what's going on, and he later writes to his sister that she put similarly the same show on for Washington. And when Washington was there, and this is an exact quote from Varick's letter, she came into the room wearing so few clothes that not even a gentleman of the family should have seen her so attired, let alone so many strangers. And George Washington is there to murder the baby, put hot irons in her head. And the whole bunch of them fell for it hook, line, and sinker. Nobody asked her if she knew about it or had had any role in it. And of course, Washington was a friend of her father's. Alexander Hamilton and Marquis de Lafayette the next day spent the whole day between them holding her hand on her bedside. Hamilton is engaged to Elizabeth Schuyler. He writes this amazing letter. He's never seen a young woman so wronged in his life. And it doesn't take much imagination when you read Lafayette's description to think that his interest in Peggy was more than that of a gentleman friend. There are innuendos in there. So Washington says, okay, Peggy. Well, so the next morning she woke up and she had recovered her senses. Down in the New York Historical Society, in Colonel Varick's papers, the morning after the mad scene is a original letter. You can go down there and hold it in your hands, in which she writes to Colonel Varick and says, Dear Colonel Varick, if you or the Army are holding any money due to General Arnold, will you please remit it to me immediately? So Washington says to her, "Oh, Peggy, I know your father. I can arrange to get you to your husband in New York, or I can arrange to get you to your father in Philadelphia. What do you want?" Now I'm inventing dialogue. "Oh, that creepy husband of mine. I don't want anything to do with him. Send me home to my father." All right, so they get horses and carriages and guards, and she heads overland from West Point to Philadelphia, which is not a one-day trip. So the stopping point was Paramus, which was not then full of shopping centers, had a beautiful house, which is still there and open to the public, called the Hermitage, occupied by a lady who Peggy knew, who was Aaron Burr's fiancée. Now, what we find out in 1840, when Burr's memoirs are published, is that he says when Peggy got there, this hostess's name was Theodosia. And this is a little invented dialogue, but I think it makes the point accurately. She said, "Theodosia, get rid of the servants. I need to talk to you alone." And they go alone into a room, and Peggy says, "Oh my God, we had this plot going and we were going to make a lot of money, and it all blew up at the last minute, and I don't know what's going to happen. And the worst thing is I am sick and tired of putting all these airs on to convince everybody that it wasn't my fault." So this comes out in 1840, and the Shippen family is incensed. And the counter contentions from them were that Burr had tried several times to seduce Peggy, and she had spurned him, and he waited till his memoirs were published after his death to get even with her. So there was this controversy that went on from 1840 to 1920 about whether she was culpable in the plot or not. But anyway, she gets to Philadelphia, and our friend Joe Reed is still the governor of Pennsylvania. And he, within days, got the Pennsylvania legislature to enact a statute banishing her from Pennsylvania for the duration of the war. So her father and mother, they put her in a carriage with her father, and they take her to beautiful scenic Jersey City, where she is turned over to the British. That was the last time, except for once, that she ever saw her mother, her father, or any of her brothers and sisters. So we're now in New York. Arnold has a fancy house on Lower Broadway, and within 2 months, Peggy is expecting child number 2. She eventually conceives 5 of Arnold's children, one of which died in infancy, but there were 3 sons and a daughter. In her letters, she was very candid about her daughter. This is written from London. She told people that her daughter, between being very ugly and having no inheritance, would never find a husband, but she did. Peggy is awarded on her arrival in New York by General Clinton a lifetime pension of £500 sterling per year, quote, "for her meritorious service to His Majesty's government." Okay? A little further evidence, in my opinion, that she may have had a whole lot to do with this scheme that didn't work. The war ends, off they sail to England. Arnold has half pay for life as a general in the British Army. She's always badgering the British General Clinton for more money. The children are all given lifetime pensions of £100 a year. Her boys end up all with careers in the British Army, mostly serving in India. The ugly daughter goes to India to visit her brothers, and they fix her up, and she marries another British officer named Phipps. So they really all lived happily ever after. And most of the descendants today are in Europe. Arnold, to supplement his income, goes back into the shipping business, which he had been in before the war. And he can't obviously call safely on American ports. So he deals with loyalists who've moved mostly to New Brunswick in Canada and St. John's. He gets a business going over there. He entertains himself together with a local lady. He conceives an out-of-wedlock child. Peggy's letters alternatively refer to the child as the boy or him. And Peggy had a lot to say about whether Arnold's will made any provision for him. Arnold was always getting in trouble, doing business ventures that didn't make any money. Peggy soldiers on, makes friends. They live comfortably because of her pension and the income for the boys. And then Arnold in 1800, has a business venture that's just a disaster. And then at age 61, he dies in 1801, leaving Peggy as a 41-year-old widow. At this point in time, the oldest boy is in the British Army serving in India, and she writes him a series of letters. He's her closest relative. This is the same child who was being nursed when the treason plot blew up. I forgot, let me just interrupt to say, in Talmadge's custody, Andre is taken to West Point and then down to where a headquarters at the time was in Tappan, New York. He is tried by a military commission of 13 officers. He put up for the lawyers in the room a very clever defense. I don't know, he had to come up with this all on his own. He said he was behind Patriot lines, under orders of a Patriot general, under a flag of truce, which under the rules it protects you. And he only went into civilian clothes under the orders of a then Patriot general, so therefore he wasn't really a spy. And behind enemy lines out of uniform, and therefore he should just be returned to British lines. The 13 generals on the military commission, thinking no doubt of Nathan Hale, would have nothing to do it. So he's ordered to be hanged. This then starts a high-tension negotiation between the British commander and George Washington, done by letters and emissaries, where Clinton, the British general, says, okay, I want him back. What do I trade? And Washington says, that's easy. You give me Arnold, I'll give you Andre. The British officers can't give Arnold back because if you give up one deserter, you may never get any more. It's not safe to desert anymore. So then Andre writes a letter to George Washington, says, I wish to die like a soldier and I wish to be shot by a firing squad, not hanged like a common thief. And Washington doesn't reply, but Alexander Hamilton, who's sort of fallen in love with Andres, keeps trying to persuade Washington to do it, but no reply, and they send Andre's valet through the lines so he can be hanged or killed in his best regimentals. And as Andre approaches the final movement, the valet breaks down in tears, and Andre yells at him and says, I order you to be more manly. And then he goes around a corner and sees the noose and says, well, I am reconciled to my fate, but not to the mode. And then they get him on this cart that the horses are going to pull away, and he ties his own blindfold and handkerchief and looks at the crowd and says, tell my compatriots when you talk to them that I died as a brave man. And the eyewitness accounts say thousands of American soldiers are in tears watching this. It's all very dramatic. He's hanged and buried right there on the hill in Tappan, where his remains stayed until 1820, when relations had improved with the British. He was dug up, and if you go to Westminster Abbey, you'll find his remains under a plaque in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. But anyway, that catches us up with Andre. So Peggy is now the widow and writing to her son in India, and it's perfectly clear from the letters that a couple of gentlemen would like to get better acquainted with her. But unfortunately, she develops ovarian cancer and dies 3 years later in 1804 at age 44, and she's buried in Battersea with Arnold out there. Her daughter comes back from India and goes through her things. Every woman in this room, if not the guys, have special things of importance to them in a special place. And when the daughter goes through the special things, what does she find? She finds a cameo, opens it up, and inside is a lock of John Andre's hair. Anyway, thank you for your patience. That's the yarn about the most dangerous teenage woman in American history. Now, if anybody has a question, I'll be glad to answer it. If not, thanks for coming, and we can move on. Yes, sir. And the gentleman.
Saying Talmadge, who was one of Washington's intelligence officers?
Yeah, Benjamin Talmadge, he had been appointed sort of secretly by Washington, which the colonel didn't know, as Washington's head of intelligence in the New York area. And there's a lot of good books about sort of stuff that isn't very well documented. Spies were going across Long Island Sound, and the intrigue is fascinating. But Talmadge later becomes a member of Congress, and he was a member of Congress when the three men who captured Andre tried to get a big pension out of the federal government. And you read what Talmadge had to say about them, and his position then supports the view that these were not patriotic guards, and that for enough money they'd have sent Andre south in a minute. But reasonable people can differ about Mr. Von Wert and Mr. Paulding and the other guy. They have, there are death masks of all three of them that the New York Historical Society has. They were regarded as important heroes at the time. But Benjamin Talmadge was one of the finest young officers that George Washington had. There's a book by an author named Arthur Lefkowitz called Washington's Indispensable Men, which I'm not sure Talmadge makes it actually, but it covers the role of the 34 young officers who were closest to George Washington. He called them the members of his family, and how they got along with each other and what happened to them after the war. It's quite an agreeable read. The lady had a question?
Yes, I can't understand why Peggy married Benjamin.
Well, one speculation, look, she had gotten used to military pomp and circumstance and military power, traveling with the British officer circles in the winter. She never got a clear, in my opinion, a clear signal from her father over who was the good guy and who was the bad guy. Arnold had a lot of power, rode around in carriages, wanted to put her in the fancy Mount Pleasant house. And I mean, she's not the first confused young lady who went for some older guy that she thought was rich. That's my take on it. Other people who've studied this carefully, I'm sure, would have a different point of view. But I think there's an opera about her by a University of Indiana professor, who's an elderly man now, called Twist of Treason. And he has Peggy planning the whole thing because of a secret desire to get on the other side, dump Arnold, and hook Andre. And her reward for pulling off the successful invasion of West Point was that King George was going to appoint her Queen of North America. All right, now he takes more liberties than I'm willing to. But the show, I have a DVD with a studio performance. I don't really have an expert assessment of the quality of the score, but obviously I like the story. Yes, ma'am.
You said that Peggy's father, his strategy of staying on the coast didn't work that well. What happened?
Oh, it worked perfectly. It didn't work well because I think part of the reason Peggy got in trouble was that she didn't have a clear signal from the family about which side they were on. His strategy worked great for him. You know what he was doing when Arnold and Peggy died? He was the Chief Justice of Pennsylvania. And when Arnold died and she had all these debts, there's just a mound of letters. The Pennsylvania Historical Society in Philadelphia is 41 linear feet of Shippen family letters. Now, some of them predate this whole business and some are after, but there's a huge collection of data. We don't have as much from Peggy as we wish. And we hired a genealogist, asked him to find every living descendant of Benedict, Arnold, and Peggy Shippen. Most of them are in Europe, obviously. She only got back to the United States once after Jersey City when she was visiting Arnold in St. John's, New Brunswick. So, you know, there's no way there are very many, but we hired a genealogist to find all these descendants. They ran into a lot of privacy barriers in Europe. The first guy they found was a retired doctor in Princeton. I got his number, I called him up, I explained all this. He listened to me politely on the phone. He said, "God damn it, I'm not a descendant of Benedict Arnold." And then we found a guy. Then I got a paralegal at the London office of the Davis Polk law firm to look up phone numbers for all these people in the UK. And I got a photographer in Cheshire who said, well, would you have any artifacts? We were really looking for the locket. We never found it. And this photographer called me back and said, I don't have anything, but my brother in France does. So then the brother calls me. Oh, come on over, he says. I have trunks full of stuff. Well, most of it's about Peggy, but long after she died. But he did have the originals of these letters that she had written to the son in England. We were hoping they would reveal that she confessed to him that she was the instigator of all this. But the most we could find is she says in one of the letters, well, she says, mine has been an eventful life. Did I answer your question? Any others? Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, the lady asked what happened to the 3 Arnold children from the marriage to the first Margaret. Both wives were named Margaret. I think they had British Army careers. The British Army in those days was all about connections. John Andre got his officership not by enlisting and going to Sandhurst. He bought the commission. That's how you got to be an officer. And I think, yes, ma'am.
How did you come to the story?
Years ago, I decided that I should be a good patriotic American and read a biography of George Washington. So I picked a wonderful set of books, 4 volumes by an author named Flexner, which I'll recommend to anybody. And I read it, and I learned a lot from it, and I loved it. But when I was over, I stared out the window, and there were only 2 good stories in the book. And one was Peggy Shippen, and I thought, this is a real-life Scarlett O'Hara. And so this is like 15 years ago, and I just sort of got mildly obsessed with it. And I would read something which would tell something about a footnote or hear about another book. And after 10, 12 years, I had accumulated a huge stack of stuff, and I got in a conversation with a literary agent. And he said, maybe you've got something here, write me a book proposal. So I did, and he said, fix it. And I fixed it. And he looked at me and he said, you've been practicing law too long. This reads like a loan agreement. Just right. And so I said, all right, but does this story have any legs? Yeah. He said, so I said, do you have another client who might like to write this book? Oh, I'll think about that. 3 months went by, I never heard from him. I emailed him. Oh, I forgot about that, he said. Then he came back to me with this wonderful collaborator, Mark Jacob, who is a deputy metro editor of the Chicago Tribune. And my deal with Mark was he wrote it. He had the last word about the text, and I would provide all the research for him, and he had to listen to me about all my comments. And, something like this could just be a nightmare. And mostly thanks to his patience and flexibility, we had a wonderful collaboration. It took us from January 2011 till September 1st to agree on a text, and we got it in on our deadline.
How did you track down the illustration of Peggy Shippen?
Oh, the picture of Peggy Shippen by John Andre is all over the place. If you read about the American Revolution or George Washington, there are a number of very good biographies of Benedict Arnold, and it's always in all of them. But the best book in the 20th century is also by Flexner, called The Traitor and the Spy, which is all about Andre and all about Arnold, and hardly anything about Peggy. And we tried to fill that void, but as Mark said, it's a little hard to write a biography of Peggy Shippen without talking a whole lot about Benedict Arnold. Yes?
If Peggy Shippen walked in the room right now, what would you ask her?
Oh, if Peggy Shippen walked in the room right now, what would I ask her? If I were younger, I might say, "Are you still single?" No, I'd sort of try and trot gently so she realized that I had been I hope, a careful student of her life. And then I'd whisper to her and say, "Come on, was it really your idea or not?" Expecting, if she were in a mood to be honest, that she'd say yes. Yes. Yes, sir.
Yeah, didn't Arnold lead a number of field expeditions against the colonials?
Yes.
Yes.
Indeed, he did. They were a little skeptical about whether they could trust him, but one of the most written about was he led a raid on New London and burned half of the city. And then in the months before the Cornwallis surrender in Yorktown, he was leading British forces and once came very close to capturing Thomas Jefferson. He was, by all accounts, responding to the question about what did Arnold do as a British general. Whoever he was fighting for, he was a terrific commander, leading his people from the front, taking risks, clever tactician, committed to winning whatever he was supposed to win. Hey, what a great group.